Well, I think we should put it in context. Every year, the IDF puts out these data figures and stats, end of year sum up. But I think the two key takeaways are, number one, what's happening in the West Bank, where terror stats, shooting attacks, and other sorts of attacks are rising, and 3 or 4 year highs. And I think that's quite concerning and says a lot about the meeting last night between Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and Benny Gantz. And on the flip side, number two, yes, the attacks in Syria and other places in the Middle East to try to thwart Iran's entrenchment. And we saw that about 2 nights ago, alleged Israeli strike in the port of Latakia in Syria, alleged Iranian weapons shipment.
Now, on those lines here, there's ongoing alleged strikes in Syria here. What do we know of the status of the Hezbollah threat? We are led to believe this is connected to arming Hezbollah.
Right. Well, the Hezbollah threat is significant. It has been significant for a number of years now. But the concern on the part of the Israelis is that it will grow even more. And so what we've seen in recent years, this campaign between the wars, where Israeli jets primarily attack targets in Syria primarily to stop these Iranian weapon shipments via Syria to Lebanon and to Hezbollah. It's all part of this broader strategic competition between Israel and Iran, obviously in the Middle East. And so Israel is trying to stop its enemies from getting stronger and stronger, with an eye perhaps to a future military action related to Iran's nuclear program. That's the real, or it could be the real detonation point, both for Israel and Hezbollah and Israel and Iran in the broader Middle East.
Now, obviously, this report, year-end report as it is, it emerged significantly at a time where the talks are underway in Vienna here with world powers here. But since another angle to bring in here with Russia at the table in Vienna here now, since Prime Minister Bennett and President Putin met in Sochi, I believe the end of October, there's been virtually Russian silence on these alleged strikes in Syria by Israel. Is there thought to be a widening rift between Russia and Assad and Iran, perhaps?
Well, there have been rumors of this rift now for quite some time. I tend to think it's a bit overstated. It's true that there is strategic competition between Russia and Iran over Syria. In other words, Russia would like to be the main ally and supporter of the Assad regime in Damascus, and Iran would like to do that as well. And so there is this kind of competition between Iran and Russia, but I don't think we should overstate it. There are commonalities, common interests for Russia and Iran, primarily propping up the Assad regime, as it did very successfully during the Syrian civil war, which they essentially won for the Assad regime. But it is true that Russia perhaps is taking a bit of a back seat or less of a public stance against Israeli strikes against Iran and its proxies and these Hezbollah weapons shipments. That is also a Russian interest to try to keep the Eastern Mediterranean at least stable for the coming months and perhaps coming year, notwithstanding what's happening in Vienna.
And again, with that happening in Vienna in the background, and Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, just here recently, what do we know about the level of coordination, or I should say maybe common strategy between Israel and the U.S. towards Iran?
Well, it's no surprise, and it's been very public, there are differences of opinion between Jerusalem and Washington over the Vienna talks. But having said that, I think Jake Sullivan's recent trip actually minimized those differences. I think given Iran's hardline stance returning to the negotiations in Vienna, I think even the American negotiators understand that more leverage is needed, more harder line vis-a-vis Iran and what it's asking at the negotiating table. And that delves very, very nicely with where Israel is. Israel has been prodding the Biden administration for several months now to take a harder line, to increase its leverage, to put on the table at least a credible economic and perhaps military threat vis-a-vis Iran if the talks fail. So that's a very comfortable position for the Bennett-Lapid government to be in. And I think stemming from Jake Sullivan's trip, that became a lot more public. But really the ball is in Iran's court if it comes back to the nuclear talks this week in Vienna and shows some good faith. I think the Americans will roll with that, and Israel will wait and see to see what comes out of Vienna. There is great skepticism in Jerusalem that anything will come out of the Vienna talks.